After Vernon passed away, his two sons from a previous relationship said to me point blank, "We want the entire inheritance, the company, everything." My lawyer begged me to fight. He said I had rights, I had grounds, I could drag this through court for years, but I only answered with one sentence, "Give them everything." People thought I had lost my mind. And at the final meeting, as I signed the papers transferring my rights, Vernon's two sons smiled, the smile of men who believed they had just won a perfect game, until their lawyer read just one sentence in that document. That smile vanished. His face went pale. "My name is Serafina Coleman. Everyone calls me Sarah. Stay with my story until the end, and comment the name of the city you're watching from so I know how far this story has traveled." The funeral flowers were still fresh when they decided to destroy me. I sat in Vernon's leather chair, in our home office, the chair where he had spent countless evenings reviewing business files, signing papers, and telling me about the future we would walk into together, 22 years of marriage. And now I had to sit there, in that very room, pretending that the two men standing in front of me had any right at all to decide my fate. Kendrick, Vernon's eldest son, stood across from me. He wore his father's death like an expensive suit, tailored perfectly, crafted to serve his own interests. At 45, Kendrick had the same commanding presence Vernon once had, but the warmth, the kindness that made Vernon the man I loved, was not there. His steel-gray eyes moved over me, cold and precise, like a businessman assessing a failed investment. "Sarah," he said, in that lowered voice I had learned to hate over the years, "we need to discuss a few practical matters." Beside him stood Quentin, 3 years younger than his brother, yet looking older with early balding and a softer, weaker jaw. He stood slightly angled toward Kendrick, like a loyal lieutenant always ready to nod on command. If Kendrick was sharp edges and cold, calculated moves, then Quentin was passive aggression wrapped in a shell of fake concern. "We know this is very difficult," Quentin added, his voice gentle, full of sympathy. False sympathy. "Losing Dad so suddenly. This is really hard for all of us." Hard for all of us. As if they were the ones holding Vernon's hand through the long hospital nights. As if they were the ones forced to make impossible decisions about treatment and pain control. Of course, they showed up for the funeral. Kendrick flew in from Seattle. Quentin drove in from Bellevue, where he ran some vague consulting company. But throughout the 3 months Vernon fought his illness, when everything truly mattered, I was there, alone. For you to understand why Quentin's words, "hard for all of us," made me want to slap him across the face, I need to tell you about those 3 months. 3 months is not a number. 3 months is 90 sleepless nights in a hospital room. It is the smell of disinfectant clinging to your skin, your hair, even your dreams. It is the steady rhythm of a ventilator and the beep of the heart monitor that makes you flinch every time it changes pace. I still remember the first night Vernon was admitted, September in Seattle. It wasn't fully cold yet, but the rain had already started. Fine, persistent drizzle that seeped into your soul. We were having dinner, grilled salmon, Vernon's favorite, the dish I had made hundreds of times over our 22 years together. Then suddenly, he set his fork down. "Sarah," he said, his voice turning strange. "Do you hear bells?" There were no bells, only the soft tapping of rain against the window. But Vernon's face drained of color and his hand trembled as he reached for mine. That was his first heart attack, not the only one. Just the first. At the hospital, they said he needed surgery. Then they said surgery was not enough. He needed chemotherapy. Then they said the chemotherapy wasn't producing the results they hoped for. They had to try another approach. Every time, those decisions fell into my hands. Because by then, Vernon was too weak to choose for himself. I remember the night I called Kendrick. My fingers shook as I dialed. "Vernon is very sick," I said. "You should come see your father." "I'm handling an important case, Sarah," Kendrick replied, as casually as if he were talking about the weather. "I'll arrange it next month." Next month turned into 2 months. 2 months turned into, "I'll come when Dad is more stable." as if stable was something that could happen when someone was slowly dying. Quentin was better, in a way, or worse, depending on how you look at it. He visited twice. Each time he brought his wife, Ivana, the woman I had never truly liked, with her custom designer dresses and perfectly polished nails. They sat in the hospital room for exactly 5 minutes. They didn't touch Vernon. They didn't ask about his condition. They only glanced at their watches, then said, "We have to go. We have an appointment." But I stayed. I stayed through those 90 nights. I sat beside Vernon's bed and read to him. His beloved detective novels, business articles, even poetry, though he had never been the type to like poetry. I held his hand when the nurses came to insert needles, when the doctors brought news that grew worse by the day. I wiped sweat from his forehead when the fever rose, pulled up the blanket when he shook with cold. And on the rare nights when Vernon was lucid enough to talk, we talked about the future. "Sarah," he whispered one night like that, his eyes unusually clear, "you'll be okay. I've taken care of everything." I thought he meant the will, life insurance. The things a husband who loves his wife always plans for. I didn't know. He was talking about something much bigger. "What kind of practical matters?" I asked, even though something cold had already begun settling in my stomach. Kendrick and Quentin exchanged a look, silent communication sharpened through decades of shared secrets. It was the kind of look that excluded everyone else in the room. "People like me." "The estate," Kendrick said flatly. "Dad's assets, the real estate, the business interests. We need to arrange the division." I tightened my grip on the armrest of Vernon's chair. The leather was worn smooth after years of his hands resting there, too. I held on to that familiar feeling like a life raft. "Vernon and I discussed this very carefully," I said. "He assured me everything was taken care of." "Yes," Quentin replied, as if I were missing something obvious. Dad had provisions, but perhaps he didn't explain the complexity of the situation. Kendrick pulled a manila folder from his leather briefcase and set it on Vernon's desk, the very desk where, for 22 years, Vernon had kissed me goodbye every morning. The folder was thick, stiff, and frightening in the way legal documents always are. "The will is very clear," Kendrick said, opening the folder with a precision that felt performative. "The house in Queen Anne, worth about $850,000, will belong to Quentin and me. The villa in Kirkland by Lake Washington, $750,000, same. The business assets, about $400,000, will be divided between us." Each number landed like a punch. Our house, the place where Vernon and I built our life, hosted Christmas, celebrated anniversaries, where we talked about growing old together, gone. The villa where we spent our honeymoon, where we celebrated 10 years of marriage, where Vernon first told me he loved me, gone too. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice so small it almost dissolved into the rain outside the window. Quentin shifted, uncomfortable, but Kendrick's face didn't change at all. "Of course there's the life insurance policy," he said. $200,000, more than enough for your needs in the future. $200,000. For a 63-year-old woman who gave up her career to support her husband's family. For someone who spent 2 decades managing Vernon's household, hosting his partners, and caring for him until his final breath. $200,000 to start over. In my head, the numbers spun. $200,000 minus taxes, minus the cost of living in Seattle, one of the most expensive cities in America. "I understand," I said, though in truth, I understood nothing. This couldn't be right. Vernon promised me I would be protected, that I would never have to worry about stability. "This isn't personal, Sarah," Quentin said, his soft, fake gentleness making my skin crawl. "Dad always wanted to keep the assets in the bloodline. You understand, right?" Bloodline. As if 22 years of being Vernon's wife, being Kendrick and Quentin's stepmother, meant nothing. And then Kendrick dropped the final bomb. "Of course," he said, far too calm. "We're not heartless. You can stay in this house for 30 days to arrange things. We think that's very fair." 30 days. 30 days to erase an entire life. "Oh, and one more thing," Kendrick said, and something in his tone made me look up. He pulled out another document, smaller, but more terrifying. Dad had some major medical bills at the end. Insurance covered most of it, but there's still about $180,000 left. Because you're Dad's wife and you may have been involved in treatment decisions, the hospital is requesting that you pay. The room tilted. $180,000 in debt, $200,000 in insurance, $20,000 to rebuild an entire life. I looked at the two men in front of me, men who had called me Mom at the funeral just 3 days earlier. And in that moment, sitting in Vernon's chair, surrounded by the ghosts of the life we once had, I realized something. Vernon knew. He knew exactly what kind of men his sons were, and he left me something. I was sure of it. Only one question remained. What was it? In the next part, I'll tell you about the small key I found in Vernon's desk drawer and why it made everything Kendrick and Quentin thought was certain begin to collapse. Don't go anywhere. The next part is when the real game begins. I needed to understand. I needed to know what was truly happening. After Kendrick and Quentin left, Kendrick driving his brand new BMW toward downtown Seattle, leaving me alone in the house I was about to lose, I sat motionless in Vernon's office for 3 hours. The afternoon light slowly shifted from gold to orange and then down into the pale purple of a Seattle sunset, the kind of light Vernon and I used to love. And now it felt like a reminder that the life I built was being taken from me piece by piece. I stood up, walked to his desk, and opened each drawer. Not because I knew what I was looking for, but because I needed to feel that he was still here, touching the things he had touched, seeing what he had kept. The top drawer held ordinary office supplies. The middle drawer held old tax files and receipts. The bottom drawer held a photo album and letters. The letters were mine, love letters I wrote to Vernon 20 years ago, and he had kept every single one, each and every letter, as if he always knew they would become the thing that held me together when everything fell apart. I pulled one out and reread a few lines. Tears blurred my vision. I wiped them quickly, afraid I might smudge the past. And right then, I saw it. At the bottom of the drawer, beneath the letters, was a small brown envelope. No name, no label, but when I lifted it, I could feel something hard inside. My heart started pounding. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a small brass key, old, polished smooth, as if it had been handled again and again. Along with it was a folded piece of paper, Vernon's handwriting. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the boys have shown you their true nature. Take this key to First National Bank, Bellevue branch. Ask to see Phoebe Lynn. Trust me, Sarah, I have taken care of everything. Forever yours, V. I read the note 5 times over. Vernon knew. He knew Kendrick and Quentin would do this, and he had prepared something. Right then, I want you to understand this. If this were just an ordinary key, Vernon would not have hidden it in the most private place, and he would not have written to me in the tone of a final message. That meant behind this key wasn't just money. It was a truth. And if Kendrick and Quentin had known that truth before I did, they would not have given me 30 days. From the moment I held that key, the rules of the game changed. To understand why the key mattered so much, I have to tell you what happened 6 months before Vernon died. March. Seattle was entering an early spring, drizzle, cold air, but the cherry blossoms were starting to bloom. Vernon and I took a walk around Queen Anne like we often did, but that morning he was strangely quiet. Sarah, if something happens to me, will you be okay? He asked. I smiled, trying to lighten the mood, but Vernon didn't smile. He looked at me seriously and said he only wanted to be sure I would be protected. After that day, Vernon changed. He stayed in his office more, took calls he didn't explain, held meetings downtown, and always said, just normal business. But I could see worry sitting on his face. One evening in April, I accidentally overheard him on the phone. I need proof that can't be denied. Yes, both of them. No, my wife can't know yet. It would hurt her too much. His voice carried the pain of a heart that had been betrayed. Now, sitting here with the brass key in my hand, I understood. Vernon knew what Kendrick and Quentin were planning, and he spent the last 6 months of his life protecting me from his own sons. But before going to the bank, I needed to understand the legal situation clearly. The next morning, I went to see Miles Hartman, Vernon's family attorney for 15 years. His office was on the 15th floor, overlooking Elliott Bay, beautiful in a way that felt cruel on a day when I was about to be sentenced to having nothing. Miles said the will had been signed 18 months ago. The real estate and the business assets all went to Kendrick and Quentin, and I had only the insurance and a medical debt of $180,000, and technically it was my responsibility. I asked, "What if I want to fight?" Miles said it was possible, but it would take years, cost heavily, and would have to rely on unclear points. I shook my head. Vernon was clear-minded. He knew what he was doing, and I realized I had only two paths. One was to throw myself into a long legal battle and become the greedy stepmother in the eyes of the world. The other was to trust Vernon, to trust that he left me something more important than houses. I chose to trust Vernon. I stood up and looked Miles straight in the eyes. "Miles, I want you to draft the papers. I will give up every right to the real estate. I will give Kendrick and Quentin exactly what they want." Miles froze, warning me that once I signed, there would be no turning back. I answered, "I know. That's exactly what I want." When I walked out of his office, I didn't feel like I was surrendering. I only felt, for the first time since Vernon died, I was following a plan, his plan. And what was the next step? To meet Phoebe Lynn at First National Bank, Bellevue branch, and find out what this brass key opened. The 520 bridge connecting Seattle to Bellevue stretches more than 2 miles across Lake Washington. It was a route I had driven hundreds of times, taking Vernon to meetings, stopping by Bellevue Square to shop, or simply watching the lake on those rare, beautiful sunny days in Seattle. But today, every meter of road felt elongated. My hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. 1,000 questions spun in my head. What had Vernon hidden in that safe deposit box? Why hadn't he told me while he was alive? And most importantly, would what he left behind be enough to change everything? First National Bank in Bellevue sat on NE 8th Avenue, a modern glass building with white granite columns, bright, cold, and severe. The kind of bank wealthy people use to hide secrets they don't want even their closest family members to touch. I parked, but I stayed seated for a moment longer just to breathe. The brass key in my handbag felt heavy as lead, as if the moment I stood up, my entire life would be pulled along with it. Finally, I walked in. The air inside the bank was so cool it was nearly freezing. The scent of leather, polished wood, and the invisible scent of money. The kind of scent that makes you feel both reassured and uneasy. A young woman at the reception desk smiled at me. "I need to see Phoebe Lynn," I said, and I hated that my voice shook more than I wanted it to. "Do you have an appointment, ma'am?" "No, but—" I pulled out Vernon's note, forcing my hands not to tremble. My husband, Vernon Coleman, mentioned her. The moment she heard Vernon's name, her smile changed, from professional politeness to something genuinely warm. "Oh, Mrs. Coleman, yes, please wait just a moment." About 3 minutes later, an Asian woman in her 40s stepped out. Her black hair was neatly tied back, her gray suit elegant, but her eyes were warm in a way most bank employees never are. "Mrs. Coleman," she said softly, "I've been expecting you. Mr. Coleman told me that one day you would come." "I'm very sorry for your loss." "You knew Vernon?" I asked, surprise making me forget to stay composed. "He came here a few times over the past 6 months," Phoebe replied. "Always alone, always very careful. He gave specific instructions. Only you would be permitted to open the box." That sentence tightened something in my chest. Over the past 6 months, Vernon had been coming here alone, doing things he couldn't tell me about, then returning home, still looking at me, still calling me my love, as if nothing was happening. Phoebe led me down a white marble staircase, through a heavy steel door, and into the safe deposit vault. Rows of metal boxes stacked one above another, sealed, cold, and silent, like secrets packaged neatly away. Phoebe stopped in front of a numbered box. She inserted the bank's key. I took out Vernon's brass key. 2 keys turned at the same time. Click. Box 379 opened. Phoebe pulled out a long, heavy metal case and placed it on a table inside a small private room. "Would you like me to stay?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, thank you. I need to be alone." The door closed with a very soft sound, and then silence dropped over everything, so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. I stared at the metal's case the way you stare into a deep abyss. Vernon had touched it. Vernon had opened it. Vernon had placed things inside with hope or fear that one day I would find them. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside was not money, not gold, not jewelry. It was documents, a lot of documents. And a letter. A thick white envelope, my name written on the outside in Vernon's handwriting. "My dearest Sarah, read last." I set it aside, not because I didn't want to read it, but because I knew if I opened that letter right away, I might break before I understood the whole picture. I pulled out the first document. It was a printed email chain. From Kendrick's email address, sent to someone named Marcus Crawford. Date, 8 months ago. "Marcus, Dad is getting worse. The doctors think he has about 6 months. We need to move faster with the transfer procedures. Can you accelerate the paperwork we discussed?" I felt the blood drain from my face. The reply below made my heart nearly stop. "Kendrick, I've prepared the documents as requested. Once your father signs, the business assets will be restructured under the shell companies we've established. Personal real estate can be transferred immediately after death." Then came the question that turned my whole body cold. What about the wife? And Kendrick's response, "Sarah won't be an issue. She doesn't understand the business side. And by the time she realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. Dad trusts us completely." I had to read it 3 times before the meaning truly sank in. They had planned it, while Vernon was dying, while I was holding his hand through endless nights. Kendrick and Quentin had been planning to steal, not only from me, but from their own father. My hands shook so hard I had to set the paper down and force myself to breathe. But there was more. The next document was a bank statement for an account I had never heard of. Whitaker Holdings, LLC. Balance, $4,700,000. $4.7 million. Right beneath it was a handwritten note from Vernon. "My dearest Sarah, this is our real savings. The boys think all my money is in the house and the company, but I transferred most of our assets here months ago. I'm trying to protect us." I stared at that number, then stared again. I had to read it 5 times. 4.7. We weren't poor. We weren't even doing okay. Vernon had been quietly wealthy, and Kendrick and Quentin had been trying to steal from a dying father. But wait. If you think this ends with 2 greedy sons, you haven't seen the most frightening part yet, because money can expose people. But debt, that's what makes them go insane. And right then, when I turned to the next folder, I understood why Vernon had hidden everything inside a metal case, inside a windowless room. He didn't just leave me assets. He left me a trap. The next folder was labeled Private Investigation, Top Secret. Inside were photos. Photos of Kendrick entering and leaving a luxurious casino in Reno, Nevada. The timestamps showed he had made multiple trips over the past year, sometimes staying for several days. The financial reports that came with them painted an even darker picture. Kendrick owed $230,000 to various creditors, most of it tied to gambling debt. I swallowed hard. But Quentin's file was more brutal. The investigation found that his consulting company was actually a front for a series of failed investment schemes. Quentin had lost nearly $300,000 of other people's money, including funds belonging to elderly clients who trusted him and handed him their retirement savings. Both of Vernon's sons were drowning in debt and legal trouble. No wonder they were eager to inherit. But the document that made me understand just how calculated Vernon had been was a medical report dated 3 months before he died. Not from his regular doctor, from a neurologist I had never even heard of. The summary was brief, but the conclusion was unmistakable. The patient shows no signs of cognitive decline or impairment. Mental capacity remains sharp, and decision-making ability is fully intact. Kendrick and Quentin had hinted to anyone willing to listen that Vernon's illness was affecting his judgment, that he was no longer competent to make proper decisions about his estate. But this report proved the opposite. Vernon was completely lucid until the very end. I felt anger begin to rise, not the hot kind, but a cold, icy anger, so cold it made me alert. Vernon knew. He knew what his sons were planning, and he spent his final months building a trap for them. Finally, with trembling hands, tears beginning to fall onto the paper, I opened Vernon's letter. The familiar handwriting blurred through my tears, but I read every word as if missing even one letter would mean missing him. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, I am gone, and the boys have shown you their true nature. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you all of this while I was alive, but I needed to be certain about what they were planning. I began to suspect something when Kendrick and Quentin suddenly became attentive during my illness, not out of love, but because they were positioning themselves to control my estate. I hired a private investigator, moved money, and created a complex plan to protect you. The boys think they're inheriting the house and the company, but what they don't know is that I heavily mortgaged both properties over the past year. The house carries a debt of $1,200,000. The company owes $800,000 to creditors. They are not inheriting assets. They are inheriting debt. I stopped reading. I couldn't believe what my eyes had just seen. Vernon had handed Kendrick and Quentin a poison pill disguised as an inheritance. The letter continued. The life insurance policy they mentioned is real, but it isn't $200,000. It is $500,000, and the extra amount is meant to help you start over. There is also another policy worth $300,000 that they don't know about. Sarah, I know this may seem cruel, but I can't stand by and watch them steal from you the way they've stolen from everyone else. They made their choices. Now they must live with the consequences. You deserve better than what they plan to leave you. Take the money, start over, and don't look back. Forever yours, Vernon. P.S. Contact Sterling Knox at Mitchell & Associates immediately after you finish reading. He will explain the rest. I sat in that small, windowless room for nearly an hour. My tears fell onto the letter, blurring the ink. But inside me, something became clearer, bit by bit. Vernon hadn't abandoned me. He was protecting me, the last way he still could. And Kendrick and Quentin, the two men who called me Mom at the funeral, who spoke in cliches about family and legacy, turned out to be thieves. But then another feeling crept up in my stomach and tightened it. If Kendrick and Quentin were desperate enough to steal from a dying father, what would they do when they found out their inheritance was actually a mountain of debt? Would they turn on me? Would they try to force me to help them climb out of the hole Vernon had dug for them? Carefully, I placed all the documents back into the case, except Sterling Knox's business card and Vernon's letter. I tucked those two into my handbag, like slipping a knife back into its sheath. Tomorrow I would call Sterling Knox, but tonight... My phone vibrated, a text from Quentin. Sarah, Ivana and I would like to invite Mom to dinner tonight. Thought it would be good to have family time before we finalize everything legally. 7 o'clock? Family time. I stared at that message for a long time. Then a cold, slow smile spread across my lips. They had no idea who they were playing with. I had exactly 4 hours to prepare. 4 hours to turn Serafina Coleman, the grieving, confused widow, into another version of myself, a version Kendrick and Quentin would never expect. Back at the house in Queen Anne, I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, the room Vernon and I had shared for 22 years. The bed hadn't been made since morning. Vernon's jacket still hung over the back of the chair, and his familiar scent, Old Spice mixed with cedar wood still lingered in the air, as if all I had to do was turn my head, and he would walk in and ask, "Are you okay, Sarah?" But the woman staring back at me in the mirror looked unfamiliar. My hair had gone grayer after 3 months of caring for Vernon. My face had grown thinner, my cheekbones sharper. But my eyes, those eyes were no longer the eyes of a woman who only knew grief. They were the eyes of someone preparing to step onto a battlefield. "Vernon," I whispered, as if speaking to his ghost in the room. "I understand now. I understand what you want me to do." I opened my closet. Not the black funeral dress I had worn all week. Not the simple outfits they were used to seeing on me, the kind worn by a gentlewoman, reasonable, easy to persuade. I chose the navy silk dress, the gift Vernon gave me for my birthday last year. I still remembered how he looked at me in the mirror and said, "You're at your most beautiful when you're confident." And right now I needed every scrap of confidence I could gather. I did my makeup lightly, not too heavy. I didn't need them thinking I was trying to impress. Just enough to look like a woman in control of herself. But I knew. The most important thing wasn't my appearance. I sat at Vernon's desk, opened my laptop, and reviewed every document I had photographed at the bank. Read, memorize. Rehearse in my head. Place each piece into its proper position. The emails between Kendrick and Marcus Crawford, 8 months ago, Kendrick's gambling debt, $230,000, Quentin's losses from defrauding clients, $300,000. The medical report proving Vernon was lucid, 3 months before he died. I didn't just need to know the truth, I needed to understand it deeply enough to turn it into a weapon. Then I stood in front of the mirror and began to practice. "Kendrick, how thoughtful of you to care about Mom." No. Too smooth, too performed. They would smell the falseness. I tried again. "Thank you for inviting me to dinner. I know this week has been hard for all of us." Better. More real, soft enough to make them careless. I imagined Kendrick asking about the paperwork, asking if I was ready to sign. I spoke with Miles Hartman. I practiced, my voice calm. "I think the best thing is for everything to go smoothly. Family matters more than assets." Family matters more than assets. That was the sentence they wanted to hear. The sentence that would make them exhale. The sentence that would make them believe I had surrendered. But in my mind, the truth was so clear it was chilling. They were not my family. They never were. My family was Vernon. And now that he was gone, all I had left was myself. Strangely, that didn't feel as frightening as I once thought. If anything, it felt like being released from a cage. I looked at the wedding photo on the desk. "Vernon," I said softly, "I won't let you down." Quentin and Ivana's home in Bellevue was a monument to borrowed money and fake success. Medina, the neighborhood where Bill Gates lives, where mansions worth tens of millions overlook Lake Washington. Quentin's house wasn't as large as the castles around it, but it tried very hard to look like it was. In the circular driveway, 2 brand-new vehicles sat prominently, a BMW X7 and a Mercedes-Benz GLE. I knew their price, together, more than $200,000. And now I also understood where that money came from elderly people who trusted Quentin with their retirement funds. Ivana opened the door wearing a Versace dress. I recognized it immediately because I'd seen it in Vogue, priced at $3,500. Perfect golden highlights, burgundy red nails polished to a shine. "Sarah!" she cried, pulling me into a hug that was a hug without skin contact. "You look amazing. Your skin looks so much brighter." Brighter? I had lost my husband 3 weeks ago. "Thank you, Ivana," I replied, my smile resting only on my lips, never reaching my eyes. Kendrick was already there, seated in Quentin's study with a glass of scotch in his hand. The room was all dark wood and leather, designed to display success and stability. But now I could see what it truly displayed. Desperate striving. "Mom," Kendrick said, standing to give me a brief hug. "You look better. I was worried about you after our conversation the other day." Worried? He was worried about me. after telling me I was about to be homeless and nearly bankrupt. What a thoughtful son, I said, keeping my voice just warm enough. Quentin appeared from the kitchen carrying a glass of white wine. Sarah, I'm glad you came. Ivana's been cooking all afternoon. Pan-seared salmon with lemon sauce, the way you like it. Pan-seared salmon. The dish Vernon and I ate at our last dinner before he was hospitalized. Did they know? Or was it just a cruel coincidence of fate? Dinner was served in the formal dining room. China that looked like it belonged in a museum. Silverware heavy enough that, if necessary, it could be used as a weapon. Ivana really had outdone herself. The salmon was perfectly cooked. The wine pairing was exactly right. Everything was presented without a single flaw. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have been touched. And then I realized something strange. It wasn't that I was trying to transform myself to fool them. It was that I was returning to who I truly was. Serafina Coleman had spent 22 years living in a world of polite dinners, measured smiles, half-truths wrapped in etiquette. I had learned how to read a room, how to hear what wasn't being said, how to catch a shift in someone's gaze in a single second. I had forgotten that skill, because I trusted I was living inside a family. But tonight, sitting across from Kendrick and Quentin, I remembered everything. And I knew all I had to do was flick the right piece of information, and they would reveal themselves. So, Kendrick said as we reached the main course. Miles Morrison called me this afternoon. He said Mom is ready to move forward with the estate transfer. I took a small bite of salmon, chewing slowly, not because I was hungry, because I needed time to observe. Yes, I said at last, I've decided that fighting Vernon's wishes isn't how I want to live the rest of my years. Harmony in the family matters more than money. I saw a flash of relief cross Quentin's face, so fast that if I hadn't been focused, I would have missed it. It was almost funny. That is truly wonderful, Sarah, Quentin said, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to sound normal. Dad would be so happy to know we're working together, Ivana added, her voice too bright. Oh, we've prepared some paperwork, just to make everything official. Our attorney drafted it to supplement what Miles is handling. She stood and retrieved a manila folder placed on a nearby cabinet. Of course they brought in their own attorney. I wondered, did that attorney know about Kendrick's gambling debt or Quentin's investment fraud? How thoughtful, I said, but I didn't touch the folder. But I think I should bring up one thing, the medical bills. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Kendrick set his glass down a little too hard. Mom, what are you thinking about that? Oh, $180,000 is a significant amount, I said casually, as if discussing gas prices. I've been wondering whether we should ask the accountant to review the estate's liquid assets before I commit to taking on that debt. Kendrick and Quentin exchanged a glance, the same silent communication I'd seen in Vernon's office, but this time I could read what hid behind it. They were afraid I might discover something. Sarah, Kendrick said slowly, carefully, I think we already explained this. The estate assets are tied up in the inheritance process. The medical bills are separate from the inherited assets. Of course, I nodded easily, but Vernon was always meticulous about records. I'm sure there must be documentation proving which amounts belong to the estate and which are considered personal responsibility. Ivana laughed, the sound a little too bright. Oh, Quentin handles all that boring financial stuff, doesn't he, honey? Quentin nodded so quickly he nearly choked. Absolutely. Everything has been categorized properly. The medical expenses fall to you because you were Dad's wife and involved in treatment decisions. That makes sense, I said. It's just, I find it interesting that Vernon never seemed worried about medical costs. He always seemed confident we had full insurance coverage. The silence stretched, a beat longer than normal. Kendrick cleared his throat. Insurance doesn't cover everything. Dad's treatment was quite expensive in the final months. Then maybe I should contact the hospital directly, I said, my eyes never leaving their reactions. Request an itemized statement of what's still owed and see how much insurance actually paid. Quentin's fork dropped onto his plate with a sharp clink. No, "No need, Sarah," he said quickly. "I handled all of it." "Thoroughly." "I'm sure you did," I replied. "But as Vernon's widow, I feel responsible for understanding the financial details of his final illness. It's the least I can do, for his memory." Ivana suddenly shot up from her chair as if yanked by a string. "Who wants dessert? I made a chocolate cake from a Food and Wine magazine recipe." She practically ran into the kitchen. I didn't miss the meaningful look Kendrick threw at Quentin. They were panicking, just slightly, but they were panicking for real. "Sarah," Kendrick said, leaning forward, trying to drape himself in that fatherly tone he thought he could impose on me. "I hope you're not reconsidering the agreement, because someone said something that confused you. Sometimes people unfamiliar with inheritance law give bad advice." "Oh, no," I answered at once, gentle. "I'm not reconsidering anything. I'm just being thorough. Vernon always said, the devil is in the details." "Dad loved his paperwork." Quentin forced a laugh, but his lips had gone pale. "Yes," I said, and then I let my next line fall like a pin dropped into still water. "Actually, I found some documents in his office that I don't understand. Bank statements for accounts I've never heard of. Business paperwork for companies I didn't know he was involved with." The color drained from Quentin's face so quickly it was almost pitiful. "What kind of documents?" Kendrick asked, his voice tense but trying to sound normal. "Oh, probably nothing important," I said, pretending to be confused. "Just complicated financial reports." "But—" I paused just long enough. "I did find a safe deposit box key I've never seen before." Kendrick froze completely. "A safe deposit box key?" "Yes." I tilted my head as if even I found it odd. Strange, isn't it? I thought I knew all of Vernon's financial arrangements, but clearly he had a few accounts and boxes I didn't know about. Maybe I should check before we finalize everything. The look the brothers exchanged this time wasn't silent communication anymore. It was pure panic, covered too late. "Mom," Kendrick said, his voice roughening for a split second before he forced it back into softness. "You shouldn't stress yourself with those papers. Legal documents are very confusing for someone without a business background. Why don't you bring them to the next meeting? Quentin and I can help you sort what matters and what doesn't." I smiled at him. An easy smile, one a woman gives to men who have always believed they're smarter than everyone else. "Of course, Kendrick," I said. "Family should help family." But as I drove home that night, I caught Kendrick in my rearview mirror. He stood in the driveway, his phone pressed tight to his ear, his gaze stretched taut as wire. I knew that was a call he couldn't wait to make inside the house. They were panicking, and the game had only just begun. My phone vibrated the moment I stepped into the house. An unfamiliar number, area code 26, Seattle. "This is Sterling Knox with Knox & Associates." The man's voice was deep, steady, the kind of voice that never wasted a word. "I believe you have certain documents that belong to my office." My heart slammed. "Mr. Knox," I tightened my grip on the phone. "Do you know how I found them?" "Your husband was very specific in his instructions," he said. "He told me that if you were able to open the safe deposit box, I was to contact you within 24 hours. And Mrs. Coleman, we need to meet immediately. There are things about your husband's estate you must know before you sign anything with Kendrick and Quentin." "What things?" "I can't discuss it over the phone." Sterling Knox paused for a beat, then cut straight to it. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. My office in Pioneer Square. Can you make it?" I looked at the clock. 10 at night. 11 hours from now. Felt as long as an entire lifetime. "I'll be there," I said. Sterling Knox's office didn't resemble Miles Hartman's polished suite. It was inside an old brick building in Pioneer Square, the oldest neighborhood in Seattle, and it carried a very different feeling. Alive, real, like a place where people work to solve problems, not to display success for clients to admire. Sterling Knox was in his 60s. He had kind eyes and hands that showed he had built everything himself. No Armani suit, just a rolled-sleeve dress shirt, khakis, and the straight posture of someone used to facing storms. "Mrs. Coleman." He stood and shook my hand. Thank you for coming so quickly. We have a lot to discuss. He opened a thick file. I recognized it immediately, copies of many documents I had seen in the safe deposit box, and others I had never seen at all. Your husband retained me about 8 months ago, Sterling began. At first, it was simply to conduct a discreet investigation into a few financial irregularities he noticed. But as we uncovered more information, my role expanded significantly. He pulled documents out and laid them in layers across the table, like laying out a battle map. The investigation shows Kendrick forged his father's signature on loan documents, using the family business as collateral to pay gambling debts, Sterling said slowly, each word like a nail being driven in. And Quentin is worse. He systematically transferred funds from client accounts into shell companies he created himself. A sharp cold ran down my spine. That's criminal? I asked, my voice turning rough. Sterling nodded, grave. Grand theft, wire fraud, elder abuse. He looked directly at me. Your husband could have demanded the arrest of both of them. But he chose a form of justice, more creative. Sterling pulled out another set of papers. These are the property records for the Queen Anne house and the Kirkland estate. As of 6 months ago, both were mortgaged to the maximum. He placed a finger on the figures. Your husband borrowed $1,200,000 against the house and $800,000 against the estate. I went still. But why would Vernon do that? We owned both outright. Because he knew Kendrick and Quentin would inherit, Sterling said, not circling it, and he wanted to ensure that what they inherited would come with debt attached. The proceeds from those mortgages are now safe in the Whitaker Holdings account, which only you have access to. I lowered my eyes and looked again. In my mind, the numbers added themselves up like a knock that wouldn't stop. Assets worth about $1.6 million, but total mortgage debt of $2 million. They'll owe more than the properties are worth? I heard my own voice, so small it surprised even me. Exactly, Sterling nodded. They're not inheriting assets, they're inheriting a deficit. That was when I understood why Vernon had looked at me so seriously that March morning when we walked through Queen Anne. He hadn't asked to sound dramatic. He asked because he knew the clock was counting down. And the thing that made my throat tighten most wasn't the money. It was the fact that while I sat through sleepless nights by his hospital bed, believing I was fighting alongside him, Vernon had been fighting another battle too, completely alone, a battle against his own 2 sons. And now, sitting here, staring at these documents on the table, I realized Vernon hadn't just left me an escape. He had left me the power to decide. Sterling pulled out another document, a will I had never seen. This is the real will, he said. Executed 6 weeks before your husband passed away, not the one Kendrick and Quentin showed you. I took it, my eyes running over each line, my heart pounding like a drum. This will left everything to me, with a clause stating that if I wished, I could gift the properties to Kendrick and Quentin, meaning the choice was entirely mine. And one line stood out as if written with the full weight of Vernon himself. I leave the decision regarding what my sons, Kendrick and Quentin, will inherit, if anything, entirely to my beloved wife, Serafina, I whispered, as if speaking to myself. Vernon left me the decision. Yes, Sterling said quietly. And Mrs. Coleman, there's more. He pulled out 2 insurance policies. The life insurance policy is not $200,000. It's $500,000. And there is an additional policy worth $300,000 that Kendrick and Quentin have no idea exists. I held my breath. $800,000 from insurance, plus $4.7 million in a protected account. I wasn't just safe. I was wealthy. But this is the most important part, Sterling continued, his voice solid as stone. Your husband documented everything. Every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer, every lie Kendrick and Quentin told during his illness. He met my eyes. If you choose criminal prosecution, we have enough evidence to secure convictions. My hands tightened. What happens if I don't prosecute, but I also don't give them the properties, I asked. They get nothing, Sterling replied immediately. They inherit their father's love and childhood memories, and that's it. He paused, then continued in a tone so practical it turned cold. Meanwhile, they'll still face the debts they've accumulated, and the creditors who were waiting for an inheritance to be paid won't be sympathetic. I sat still thinking. Vernon had placed the power in my hands. I could give them the mortgaged properties, a poison pill wrapped in sugar, exactly as Vernon planned. Or I could leave them with nothing. Or I could send them to prison. I looked at Sterling. Mr. Knox, I said slowly, I want to understand one thing. If I gift them the properties with the mortgages, are they legally obligated to pay those debts? Absolutely, Sterling nodded. The mortgage follows the property. They'll have 30 days to refinance or assume the loan, or they'll face foreclosure, he emphasized. And with their current debt load and credit issues, no bank will refinance. They'll lose the properties and still owe the deficiency. Exactly. In my mind, I saw 22 years of being an outsider inside my own family. The moments of being dismissed, minimized. The 3 months I sat alone by the hospital bed, while Kendrick and Quentin planned theft. And Vernon, lying there, knowing his sons were betraying him, yet using his final weeks to protect me instead of punishing them. He left the choice to me. I stood and smoothed my dress, as if I were smoothing my entire life back into place. Mr. Knox, I said firmly, I want you to draft the gift documents. I will give Kendrick and Quentin exactly what they want. Sterling studied me for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across his face. Vernon said, You would know what to do. The conference room at Morrison & Associates had never felt so suffocating. Kendrick and Quentin sat on one side of the glossy mahogany table. Both looked pale but tried to appear resolute. Miles Morrison sat at the head, more uncomfortable than I had ever seen him, and Sterling Knox sat beside me, his thick leather briefcase placed at his feet, the calm posture of a man holding every card in the deck. Sarah, Kendrick spoke before anyone else could, forcing an even tone. We're glad Mom is here. This whole thing has become very confusing. Someone has been spreading misinformation about Dad's estate, Quentin added, his voice stretched tight as a wire. Claims about different wills, hidden accounts, things that don't make sense. I folded my hands in my lap, silent. Sterling opened his briefcase. Actually, he said, polite but sharp as a blade, I'm afraid that misinformation is entirely accurate. He laid documents on the table like dealing cards, the email chain between Kendrick and Marcus Crawford, the gambling debt report, the file on Quentin's fraudulent investments, the medical report proving Vernon's mental capacity, and finally, the real will. Kendrick's face shifted from pale to gray. Quentin made a choked sound as if someone had squeezed his throat. This is harassment, Kendrick blurted, but his voice lacked confidence. You can't prove... We can prove everything, Sterling replied calmly. Bank records show forged signatures. Wire transfer records prove embezzlement. He looked straight at the two men across from him. And there's also a recorded call in which you discuss manipulating your father's estate while he was dying in the hospital. Miles Morrison stared at the stack of papers with the horror of a man realizing he had been played cleanly from the start to the very end. Sarah, Quentin said, his voice now turning desperate, surely you don't believe these fabrications. We're family, we love you. Family. They still believed that word alone would soften everything. I lifted my head. You love me? I asked softly. It was the first thing I'd said since walking into the room. Do you love me the way you loved me when you told me I'd be homeless with $20,000? I continued, my voice still gentle. Or the way you loved me when you planned to steal from your dying father? We would never... Kendrick tried to cut in. Don't, I interrupted. My voice wasn't loud, but it was steel. Don't lie anymore. I pulled out the documents Sterling had prepared. These are the gift documents, I said. I am giving you exactly what you want. The Queen Anne house, the Kirkland estate. Kendrick snatched them, skimmed them, and I watched the moment of realization, then horror, crawl across his face. But with the mortgages, he rasped. Yes, I nodded. With the mortgages, you will receive properties worth about $1.6 million, along with total associated debt of $2 million. I enunciated every word. That means you begin with a negative $600,000. Quentin broke down crying, not the performative kind, real crying. You can't do this, he sobbed. This will destroy us. We'll lose everything. I looked at him, my voice calm enough to be cruel. You should have thought about that before you started stealing from your dying father. Sterling added, his tone as measured as if he were explaining a contract clause. Of course, there is an alternative option. Mrs. Coleman can pursue criminal prosecution for elder abuse, grand theft, and wire fraud. He paused. The evidence is overwhelming. You would face significant prison time. The room fell into silence, broken only by Quentin's crying. I looked directly at the two men in front of me. So you have two choices, I said. Accept the inheritance as offered and go your own way. I paused for one beat. Or I prosecute, and you go to prison. Kendrick swallowed hard. Finally, he asked, his voice collapsing like metal being snapped. What do you want from us? I answered immediately, without hesitation, because Vernon had already thought it through for me long ago. I want you to sign acceptance of the inheritance as offered. I want you to agree never to contact me again, except through attorneys. I looked Kendrick straight in the eyes. And I want you to understand, this is what your father chose for you. I tilted my head. Not out of hate, but because you forced his hand. At last, they signed. Not because they understood, but because they had no other path. When Kendrick and Quentin walked out of the conference room, Kendrick rigid as a wooden statue, Quentin still crying uncontrollably, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel satisfied either. The only thing that remained inside me was a dull ache of sadness for a version of life that could have existed if they had chosen love instead of greed. But they chose, and now they lived with the consequences. 3 months later, I sold the properties Kendrick and Quentin couldn't afford to keep. The Queen Anne house, where Vernon and I had built 22 years of happiness, was sold to a young family with 2 children. I watched them walk through each room, run their hands along the stair rail, stand at the window where Vernon used to sit every afternoon reading the paper. Their eyes lit up, full of plans and dreams, and I knew Vernon would have liked that. The Kirkland estate as well. I sold it to a retired couple looking for a quiet place beside Lake Washington to write their memoirs. They stood on the balcony facing the water, holding hands for a long time, as if they had finally found a harbor they'd spent their whole lives searching for. As for me, I left Seattle. I moved to Cannon Beach, Oregon, a small wooden house facing the Pacific Ocean. Price, $1,200,000 paid in cash, and even after that, I still had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. The house came with a neglected garden, dry soil, weeds grown tall, old flower beds nearly dead. I began my first days there by rolling up my sleeves, putting on gloves, and doing something I had forgotten the feeling of for a long time, rebuilding a life with my own hands. I replanted rose bushes, like the ones Vernon and I used to plant together. I made an herb garden. I divided beds so flowers would bloom in cycles, planning carefully so that all year long there would always be a corner that was living, blooming, and returning. It was peaceful work, and it was satisfying in a way 22 years of living as the person who had to keep everything stable had never been. For the first time in my adult life, I was responsible only to myself. I joined the local gardening club. I took a watercolor class at the community center. I even began volunteering at an animal rescue. Simple joys. But after decades of living a life revolving around other people's needs and wants, they made me feel as though I was doing something revolutionary. One afternoon, while I was trimming roses in the front garden, a young woman stopped at the gate. She was about 30, with kind eyes and a hesitant smile, like someone weighing whether she should step into another person's story. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm Madison Knox, Sterling Knox's daughter. Dad said you might be interested in a few volunteer opportunities." I set down the pruning shears and walked to the gate. "What opportunities?" I asked. Madison drew in a breath as if choosing her words. "I work with people trying to get out of abusive relationships, financial abuse, emotional manipulation, things like that. Dad said you might understand what they're going through." I thought of myself only a few months earlier, a woman frightened, tangled up, believing she was powerless, believing she had to depend on the kindness of people who didn't care about her at all. "I can," I said, and for the first time in a long while, my voice didn't shake. "Tell me about the work you're doing." We stood right there at the garden gate, talking for a long time. And as Madison spoke, I suddenly realized the last gift Vernon left me wasn't only financial security. It was something deeper, the truth that I was stronger than I ever imagined. Smarter than anyone had ever credited me for, and capable of protecting myself, as well as others who needed protection. 2 months later, I founded the Vernon Coleman Financial Justice Fund. The fund provides legal support and financial education to victims of financial abuse within families, women and men exploited by children, spouses, or relatives. Not the legacy Kendrick and Quentin once expected would be left behind, but the truest legacy, in the way Vernon lived and loved. I heard through attorneys that Kendrick had filed for bankruptcy and was attending court-mandated gambling addiction counseling. Quentin moved back in with his mother and took a night shift manager job at a hotel near the airport. Ivana filed for divorce and moved to Los Angeles to live with her sister. When I heard those things, I didn't feel satisfied. I just felt sad. Sad for another possibility, another life. They could have lived if they had chosen differently, but they chose. And choices always have consequences. On evenings in Cannon Beach, when fog rolled in from the ocean, I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the sun set, staining the sky pink and gold. Those were the moments I felt Vernon closest to me. I remembered what he said the night he proposed. "No matter what happens, I will always protect you." He kept his promise, even from the grave. Sometimes I wondered whether Vernon would be satisfied with how it all turned out, whether he would think I had been too cruel to Kendrick and Quentin. But then I remembered his letter. "You deserve better than what they plan to leave you." Vernon didn't leave me the choice because he wanted me to take revenge. He left me the choice because he wanted me to understand the power belonged to me. And now, sitting in the garden I planted with my own hands, in the home I chose for myself, doing work that matters to me, I understood. Vernon didn't just leave me money, he left me freedom. Now I'm curious about you, the people listening to my story. If you were in my position, what would you do? Have you ever experienced anything similar? Comment below and tell me how this story reached you. And if you're enjoying stories like this, stories about betrayal, justice, and a woman rising from the ashes, subscribe to the channel for me, okay? It's just one click, but it gives me more motivation to keep telling you more stories like this. I learned one thing. Justice isn't always revenge. Sometimes, justice is simply letting people who made terrible choices live with the consequences. And sometimes, the greatest gift someone can give you isn't assets or money. It's the belief that you're strong enough to stand alone. Vernon gave me that gift. And now, through the Vernon Coleman Fund, I'm trying to pass it on to others. If you, or someone you know, is facing financial abuse from a family member, remember this: you are stronger than you think. You are smarter than they ever gave you credit for, and you deserve to be treated better. Always. Thank you for listening to my story. I'm leaving 2 other stories on the end screen that I think you'll like. See you next time.